Hello, I'm Maria Hall Brown, and this is LA Currents. Well, Plato said, poetry is nearer to vital truth than history. And I believe my guest today knows that better than anyone. I'm so delighted to be joined again by the LA Poet Laureate, almost emeritus, Lynne Thompson. So nice to have you here.
And it's lovely to be back. Thanks for asking me.
I'm saying almost emeritus because although your official tenure has continued, you are still very vibrant and still kind of, carrying the flag because a new poet laureate for the city of Los Angeles is not, at the time of this filming, been designated.
That's correct. So although my term ended December 31st, a lot of my poet friends are saying, well, Lynne, until someone else is named, you're it. So absolutely. I'm trying to continue in the same vein with some modification, of course.
Very, very cool. All right. So last time we spoke was truly almost 2 years ago. And yes. You had just, started to get your feet wet into the whole thing. And a lot has happened since then. Have you been able to kind of look in the rearview mirror and get any kind of perspective on how this whole thing has been for you?
I'm still trying to get to that point to really step away from it and have a perspective, but because a new one hasn't been appointed, I'm somewhat still in it. And of course, it was one of the most unusual, if not the most unusual of the four that we've had, including myself, because I was appointed at the height of the pandemic.
What?
And so it was a very different type of term than my predecessors. I'll put it that way. So it has taught me how to be flexible, more flexible than I thought I could be, to move quickly, to be patient. So those things I know for sure have been lessons of when you're dealing with a very fraught situation that literally affects the entire community, poets or not, all persons, little children to our seniors, we're all affected.
And to your point, exactly. I mean, I actually looked up what the Poet Laureate's responsibilities are, and it's a literal job with a list of duties that were pretty remarkable. And yet here you were given that list of duties in a tumultuous time, right. Not just with the pandemic, et cetera, but also with the civil unrest and everything like that. So right. How in the world did you even begin to do what you were supposed to do as far as gathering people and sharing poetry and everything? What were some of the things that you did?
Well, thank goodness for Zoom and whoever invented it, because although I would bet almost every person I might ask, you the same, they're sick of those little boxes and being tied to one position. That was the way that we were able to get together. And I had lots of lists of people and would just reach out and say, what about this? What about that? So, for example, one of the early readings that I had was through the local literary center Beyond Baroque, one of many that is in the greater Los Angeles area. And we actually had a Zoom reading to kick off my appointment, invited some other poets to read with me, and it went beautifully and it was well attended. I can't say it's the good side of the pandemic, but in terms of using Zoom, I think I was able to reach more people than I would have if I went to physical location A, B, and C, which tend to be small groups, 20 people. If a poet gets 100 people, they really feel like they're superstars, right? So I think I was able to reach more people, not just in Los Angeles, but across the state, across the country, really all over the globe.
You also make me think then, of course, about the necessity of things that we needed and what ended up to be priorities to us right. in a period in time in which we had to really deal with a lot of things. Did you notice that poetry during this time of stress, no matter who you are or where you are, was a salve or was a conduit to expression? I mean, what were some of the things you were taking away from what you were seeing?
Yeah, I mean, there were really divided feelings about it. I saw some people who posted on social media, for example, that they just couldn't write, that they were overwhelmed. Of course, everything moved home. So the spouse or the partner or the parent was at home. If they had children, all of a sudden, I remember one woman saying, whatever we're paying teachers, it's not enough. Yeah. Because she had stair steps like 6, 8, and 10, and she's trying to work at home, and they're at home. So, but also a lot of people said that they really turned to poetry. I started a podcast, which is one of the things I'm proudest of during my tenure. And people really looked forward to just that little nugget of poetry every week. They didn't know who it was going to be. I spent a lot of time thinking, who am I going to read? Am I going to be able to read them with the intention of the poet in my voice? So that was something that a lot of people really looked forward to. So it was a mixed bag, I would say.
What about your poetry? I mean, because you wrote during, and I've heard of some of what you have written. Do you feel that you as a poet changed and your poetry changed, or did you just embrace it more?
I don't think I wrote as much as I would have if I wasn't the Poet Laureate, because I was trying to figure out events and go to readings and give workshops and so forth. But the writing that I did do, I consider myself, who does include Los Angeles as a part of my poems, sure, particularly with my parents being immigrants and their experiences here in early Los Angeles. But I started to look at it in a more contemporary way, both the topography of it, the history of it from all different angles. And that showed up some in my poems, but I didn't write as much as I plan to now.
But you did, and you
did.
wrote something, and I don't know if this is mean of me to even say, but I just remember a few phrases that were centered around a lot of the civil unrest and a lot of the things that were happening.
Right. Even beyond Los Angeles, but certainly including Los Angeles, it is hard, I believe, for many poets, many writers, fiction, nonfiction, poetry, essays, to ignore the political climate that we're living in, because it is so fraught. And then in the middle of that comes the war in Ukraine.
Oh, yeah.
And so when I did write, I was addressing those issues, as well as we are experiencing just this past weekend in Los Angeles, a complete change in the climate.
Yeah.
Such that we know that Lake Mead that we rely on and the Colorado River are drying up. They're being lowered. We have fires. We have flooding. So it's hard to ignore those issues in poetry. And so some of what I wrote did circle around that.
So with the podcast.
Yes.
Are you going to continue it, by the way?
I have not been continuing it. I may revisit it. People have asked me about doing it in other formats. Mm-hmm. So I'm taking a little bit of a break. I was doing the podcast in conjunction with the library, who was the most fabulous partner ever. I want to give a shout out to John Szabo, who's the head of the library, to Madeline Pena and Neil Stokes, who I worked with very closely, but others on the staff that were just terrific. So the podcast was hosted by the library. And now that I'm no longer contractually the Poet Laureate, I'm looking for other platforms where I might continue it, perhaps in a slightly different way. But I loved doing it.
So what did you learn? Because you said you had to look for how to put a show together, literally, and what kind of things to share, and the poets and the poets to share.
Absolutely. The library emphasized to me that they wanted this to be for all listeners. So from the youngest children to the oldest person.
Super easy.
So of course, I didn't want to censor myself, but I was aware that young people might be listening to it. And there were some poems I thought might not be as appropriate for them. I wanted to make sure that I did honor a large segment of the Los Angeles poets, but not only Los Angeles poets. I wanted to recognize all of the communities that make up Los Angeles, because it's so rich, from the Asian American community to the African American community. So I would pick poems focused perhaps on Women's Month. They would be all women poets.
Oh, nice.
Native American poets I wanted to do more with, but found myself challenged because I couldn't always find the pronunciations that I needed. So I had to pick more. I had fewer choices, sure, or different choices, I'll say, in reading those poems where native languages were used, because I didn't want to butcher it and embarrass myself or the community I was trying to honor.
That's one of the things that I think that needs to get more apparent out there. I had the good fortune of talking to William Merwin. And one of the things that he emphasized is that poetry is meant to be heard.
Absolutely.
We always think about poetry being read silently in the classroom, or, curled up in the corner by yourself.
Right.
But poetry is meant to be heard. And having that opportunity to say poems out loud or to share other people's poetry, did that even allow you to gain a richer understanding of the meaning and the visceral feelings that poetry evokes?
Absolutely. For any of us, whether we're poets or not, reading it on the page is fine and it's wonderful. And there are all sorts of interesting things happening now with the topography of poetry. But at the end of the day, it's an oral art, and it's so much richer when a voice is behind it. But it taught me just the very basics that don't read too quickly, don't read too slowly, enunciate, preferably read the poem several times to yourself before you deliver it to an audience, because you really want the words to sparkle and to fire something in the person's ear. So that was what I was always looking for.
Unfortunately, you have such a beautiful voice that I have no doubt that they just... So you also mentioned, your own editorial standards when you were putting the podcast together, mentioning that young people. So that was also part of your charge, is to share this literary experience with children and young people. How did that all work out for you?
It was wonderful. I mean, the teachers were so challenged once they got back in the classroom. So late 2021 and into 22, people were starting to ask me to come to classrooms, often by Zoom, but occasionally in person. But you could tell that the teachers had the additional burden. They already take a lot of responsibility of trying to figure out how to normalize what these young people had come through that was so just overwhelming. And so that was a bit of a challenge, but I was just so excited to be able to go into classrooms. I also conducted some workshops with young people through a couple of local organizations, Get Lit and Write Girl, are organizations that really promote writing for young people. So I was happy to be involved in both of those. And I did put out a call for middle schoolers to send me poems that really described how they felt about various locations in the city. Oh. It could be as personal as their home, or it could be the beach, or it could be the mountains. And I got the best poems from these young people, and I was able to publish them on the library's LA Poet Laureate blog site.
Nice.
So that was very exciting to give them a platform for their voices. That was terrific.
The combination of poetry and creativity and literacy, not just literature, but literacy, is woven into the responsibilities. How are they all tied together? How do you feel they all work together? Is one beget the next?
Well, sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. And one thing I did learn as the Poet Laureate is to put aside my assumptions when I would approach any particular group about where they were vis-a-vis poetry. Some communities felt they knew a great deal about it. Others were very shy about what they knew, and certainly about recitation or writing. One workshop that I did, I want to give a shout out to the Will and Ariel Durant Library in West Hollywood, where I was invited to do a workshop, and they serve with great detail and concern a very large homeless population. Oh. So I knew when I went into the workshop that this was a different population than I was used to working with, and realized I shouldn't assume they have pens and papers and computers like so many of the other groups I might have gone into. And it was true. There was a varying skill level in that group. And the literacy for some was a question, but they were so happy to be seen and heard that I don't want to say the poetry didn't matter, but it was almost a vehicle to give them a voice, and it was lovely. It was wonderful.
Did they write?
They actually did write, many of them quite well. I remember one woman in particular asked me to read her poem to the group. And when she gave it to me, I realized that I really couldn't read her handwriting. And I said, oh, this is a problem, because I don't want to make her feel badly. And thank goodness the light bulb went off, and I said, I think your classmates would like to hear it from you. At which point she recited what she had written. And I guess she was a little surprised that I said that to her, and looked to be quite happy about it. And I always wanted to create a welcoming space for poets, non-poets, readers, fans, whatever.
You need to add that to the job description.
I need to add that to the job description.
Exactly. One of the spectacular events that you were able to participate in and create was the Day of Poetry. And I know that you've spoken numerous times about how that made such an impact on you. But for those who may not have had the opportunity to participate or anything, what was that miraculous day, and what did it feel like?
It was the highlight of my tenure. I'm very, very proud of it. The inaugural poet for Anaheim, Grant Heyer, called me, and we started talking about putting something like this together and what would it look like, who could host it. The library was very gracious in saying that we could use the Mark Taper Auditorium. Then we had to find a date, all that entailed. I knew I would never be able to get everyone, and I also knew I wouldn't even necessarily write everyone because I don't know every poet in Los Angeles. And that was a bit of a frustration, but I reached out to as many as I could. Some were on vacation, some were still a little nervous about COVID, but we ended up with approximately 125 people in attendance. Wow. We took an iconic photograph in the second floor rotunda that everybody, whether they were readers or not, was included in. That was terrific, and it's part of the library's permanent archive. And following the photograph, we went into the auditorium, and 62 poets read, including former Poet Laureate Luis Rodriguez and I believe still current Youth Poet Laureate Salome, and I am going to butcher her last name. She's Nigerian American, and she is terrific. The crowd loved her. 2 minutes for every poet except for the two of them. Had a little bit longer. I didn't read, Grant didn't read. This was a gift to the poets and to the city. It was live streamed. It represented the diversity of the city, which is what I really, really wanted. Older poets, younger poets, poets from all over the planet, because that's what we have in Los Angeles. So it looked like Los Angeles. And most of all, the poets were so happy to be in community again. They hadn't seen each other. Some people said, I've talked to so-and-so on the internet, but I've never actually met him or her. So it was nice to have the opportunity to bring them all together. And it's an event that I'm very proud of and can be found on YouTube.
That's one of the things I was going to say, is that although there were some restrictions in terms of what you were able to do, the fact that you were sort of steered towards the technological aspect of everything, whether it be Zoom or the podcast or even this live stream, means that these things will live in eternity and Absolutely. That you will be available to people all over the world. So, Absolutely. You know, it actually probably has more impact than right. even you could have imagined at this point. And even when you said you don't know all the poets, how does it feel that they all now know you? Because this title will stay with you. It doesn't yes. mean just because the term has ended. This title now is part of who Lynne Thompson is.
That's
what
correct.
Does that mean or feel like?
It's, I told somebody when I was first appointed, and perhaps I said this when we were together before, it's a vindication. Because you may remember that I'm an attorney by yeah. training, and walked away from that to pursue poetry, to learn to write the best poem I was capable of writing. And so to have this appointment and have even post the appointment, people still calling and saying, well, Lynne, could you come and do this? Yeah. Or we'd like to have you come to a variety of venues. I'll be in a church with a symphony on Sunday. Just the broad swath of creative endeavors that I've been invited to be a part of by virtue of having this title is overwhelming, and I continue to be amazed and thrilled by it.
Including, you were named an Academy of American Poet Laureate Fellow. What's that?
So the Academy of American Poets is, some may argue, but it's certainly one of the premier poetry organizations in the country. all it does every day, all day long, is promote poets and poetry through readings, through book publications, through podcasts, through Poem a Day, where you can sign up and every day in your mailbox there'll be a new poem. I was lucky enough to have a poem on a week ago.
Congratulations.
And the fellowship is a monetary recognition to support you as a Poet Laureate. These are specifically for Poets Laureate, and to support your projects and also to support you as a writer. So it's a fantastic recognition, and I was just thrilled to receive one of them.
So along those lines, future dreams, goals, obviously, you know, more books. What do you want now in terms of, since this responsibility sort of is passing, not quite yet, but it will be. What do you want? What do you want to do?
I was fortunate, as I said earlier, I didn't write a lot of new poems, but I had a lot of poems that had collected prior to the appointment. And so I was able to put them into a new collection. And I just heard within the last month that it's going to be published in 2024 by BOA Editions out of New York. Nice. And so I'm thrilled about that. But I am hoping to continue to find ways to bring poetry to a broader world, to musicians, to dancers, to visual artists, because all the arts are intricately talking to one another, and there are lots of opportunities cross-genre to celebrate language as well as the other arts. So I'm going to continue to look for opportunities to do that, and opportunities also to encourage particularly our young people. I have 3 new babies in my family, and I've said to them all separately, I am so sorry we're leaving this world for you. I'm really sorry about that. But they're our future, and I want them to understand the importance of language and communications, because we're having a little problem these days with the communication. And if poetry can help that in any way, then I'd like to champion that.
Which is a beautiful intent. And then also, when you pass the baton, you know, someone's got some pretty impressive, you know, path to follow. However, what are you going to say to this person? Because they're going to rely on you as a mentor. They're going to look to you for advice. They're going to lean on you in a way that you probably can't even fathom at this moment. So what are some of the things that you've sort of collected to share with this new person?
I certainly will tell that person, call me anytime. So many people have been so helpful to me when I call them and said, you know, I don't know what I'm doing, right? And they said, oh, Lynne will help you. It's not a problem. So certainly call on me, but also think broadly, think expansively, think out of the box, be creative. This is a time for you to try something. Yes, you're representing the city, and you always want to keep that in mind. But I never had anyone say, oh, no, Lynne, you can't do that. The city won't like it, whatever. I was able to explore the city in ways that I hadn't thought of before. And I would encourage someone to go even further than I did. And they won't have the restrictions to be able to do things out in the public a little bit more than I was able to do in really the second year. I couldn't do that in the first year. So yes, I would tell them, you know, just think out of the box and go for it, and try to reach as many people. Think about, how do I go about reaching as many people as I possibly can? Because it does make a difference in their life. You can see it in their eyes.
I know you have to literally apply for the position. Do you drop hints around people? You should apply.
I probably will do that, but on the one hand, but on the other hand, I personally feel I don't want to put my hands on the scale too much. And I also don't want anyone to think, because I'm urging them, that I will have any say
influence,
or any influence in ultimately who is selected. We have a new mayor. We have a new head, as I understand it, of the Department of Cultural Affairs. And they're the ones that will be working together to select a new Poet Laureate. So yes, I'll probably make a few suggestions, but ultimately, fortunately, it will be in someone else's hands.
Do you think this is a good asset for the city of Los Angeles?
I think it's an amazing asset for the city, because you really get to represent the city in a particular way very broadly across the world. People think of Los Angeles as a movie town, and it is a movie town, but it's more than a movie town. And you get the opportunity to tell those stories and to tell people, if I can't tell you the story, you should get in touch with so-and-so because they have an amazing story to share with you. So yes, I think it's a critical and beautiful way for the city to be represented, both within its borders and beyond.
I did ask you very early in our little chat here whether your poetry has changed, but now having spent some time, I'm wondering, have you changed by being this person for these last 2 years?
I think so. I think particularly as a writer, it's given me greater confidence. That and the fellowship from the Academy. I believe when I first interviewed with you, I was having imposter syndrome. Okay, they must have picked me because everybody else said no. They must have picked me because I had a legible application and nobody, you know, I was so stunned by it that I just kept thinking, this can't be true. But over time, I've started to trust in my instincts and the gift that I can give to the community a little bit more. And that affects all of my life, of course. It's been beyond a dream come true. It's something I never would have dreamed. So it's a real gift to me, and I just hope that I was able to give that gift back to the city.
There is no question, no doubt, and absolutely no area of concern for you, because your gift to the city of Los Angeles for the last 2 years has been literally incomparable, and it has been my incredible pleasure to sort of, as we joked about before, to sort of bookend it somewhat.
Absolutely.
But I hope that doesn't mean that you won't come back and visit.
I would love to come back and visit anytime. I love this program now, and now I kind of keep up with it a little bit more. And so yes, anytime. Please ask me, and I may call and ask you.
You can do that. And if anyone wants to see what you are doing currently or in the future, or what they can look forward to, in particular the publication of the book, what's the best way to find out about you?
On my website, www.lynnethompson.us, Lynne Thompson, all one word. I'm also on social media. You can find me there. So I try to keep the public aware of what I'm doing.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for everything.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks. And that's a wrap on this LA Currents.